Okay, so in video 1 we talked about the historical aspects. In video 2 we talked about why we want a smaller one. In this video I want to talk about why people are successful in shooting those bigger heads. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of them, kind of before I get going, I want to kind of mention that some of this might come across as arrogant or rude. And I'm not trying to make it sound that way. I don't want to ever put down anything that anybody has ever done and been successful doing. I just kind of want to make mention of maybe why it's happened that way. Sometimes when these people have taken on one of these larger points and they've been successful, and then they immediately jump on and get on me and say, well, I shot one with a 160 grain point and I got a pass through. So what you're saying doesn't mean anything. The problem with that is more often than not these people have only killed one deer, and they may have gotten lucky because they've shot between the ribs. They didn't hit anything substantial to take the energy out of it. Perhaps the point was actually relatively dull, and believe it or not, a fairly smooth edged dull point can actually penetrate a little better than a serrated point, but it doesn't cause that internal hemorrhage. But I mean, if you poke holes through lungs with a field point, you're going to kill the deer eventually. It's not necessarily efficient, but it can be done. So again, what happens is people do things once, and I've been guilty of this myself, so I'm not trying to get on anybody about it, but people do things once or twice, and then all of a sudden they're an expert. I went through that with my bow building when I was just getting started. I had built 2 or 3, 4 bows, and all of a sudden I thought I knew everything about it. I thought I was something special. A lot of guys go through that, and then you build a whole bunch more, 180 bows later or some, and I kind of realized the more you build, the more you still have to learn, and it kind of humbles you when you've shot several things with stone points and you've got a lot of successful kills, and then likewise you've learned things from things that you've lost, and you try and share that information. It kind of comes back to, I've had a lot of experience doing it, and if you've only gotten 1 or 2, it's hard to argue your fact. I'm not saying you can't kill a deer with a big point. I'm saying when it comes to efficiency, the small ones are the way to go because they are going to be more consistent and more efficient. You can pass a big stone point through a deer, especially if you don't hit lungs or anything like that. In fact, I've seen a picture of a guy that shot a pretty large point through an elk, and then I specifically asked him, did you hit any ribs? And he said no, it went straight through. So when you talk about hitting ribs, it's not a big bone, but that takes a lot out of an arrow. Stone pointed arrow, like I said before with the serrations, that catch on things. You can imagine how serrations cutting across 2 ribs this way would really slow that arrow down a lot. So if you get lucky, stand that broadhead up or that stone point up and get between those ribs, you can get a lot better penetration. There's not as much to slow it down. So, a lot of times these people, they do it once or twice, and then they get on and preach to me that their big points are better. That they either their points in general are better, or that I don't know what I'm talking about because they killed one with a big point. And again, it's not that they're uneducated or don't know what they're doing. They just don't have the experience enough. They haven't had a bad experience with a big point like I have to know that the small ones really kind of are the way to go. It's almost, you just got to kind of take somebody's word through experience on it more than anything, which again, it kind of sounds cocky, and I don't want to sound like that. I don't know everything about shooting stone points and hunting with them, but I know probably more than the average Joe does because I've done it. Another reason that some people are successful with bigger points is because they're shooting them on more modern bows. And if you like to do that, that's fine. It doesn't bother me in the least. It actually does kind of bother me when people mount them on screw and like inserts for carbon arrows or aluminums, and they shoot stone points off them. That I think that's kind of silly, personally. So sue me if you think that's silly. But there's people that shoot modern recurves, fiberglass recurves, and doweled arrows, and they put stone points on them, and they get good kills with them. And if that's your thing and you like to do it, then go for it. I'm not downing you for it at all. But I want to make the point that that fiberglass recurve that is a really high performer with a fast flight string on it and stuff is not a primitive bow. So you're taking that stone point out of context and you're putting it on something that performs better, so you are able to take a larger point. So like if you shoot a really fast fiberglass recurve and you want to hunt with a stone point, then you can probably take 130 to 160 grain stone point, put it on the end of the arrow and send it right through a deer. It would probably work. We're talking about real primitive bows, and the more primitive bow you get, really the smaller points you're going to need. Now obviously you can compensate for some of that by the bow weight and in getting a better performing bow. If you take this bow here that I've been working on, this one I made all with stone tools. It's a good performing bow, but it's a little sapling bow, and it's got a sinew string on it. And that's another really important primitive aspect that people don't realize, is when you have a sinew string or a rawhide string that doesn't perform as good as B50 Dacron, and certainly not as good as Fast Flight, you're not going to have the energy that's transferred into the arrow to be able to push that big point through. And again, I'm not saying you can't get a big point through, but reliably the smaller points are the way to go. So again, some of these people that are successful with the bigger points, they're shooting them off more modern equipment, or they're just kind of getting lucky doing it. But again, without trying to sound arrogant about it, you know, when you have enough experience and you've had bad experiences with big points and good experiences with the smaller ones, you start to preach to other people saying, hey, I don't want you to make the same mistakes that I did. Let those 125 to 150 points go. Chip them things down to be smaller points. You can actually get the weight up in the arrow to make up for the weight loss of the point. So that's not the trouble. You can also make points that have a short cutting surface and a long tang on them that would still be heavy points if you're insisting on having a heavy point. You just don't want that huge cutting edge that's going to slow the penetration of the arrow. It's more important, again, to have that small point so it penetrates better.